This podcast is brought to you by the GTFurther Team in conjunction with Cartography.
We go further when we honor the trek.
This is your host, Kelly Mead, 2017 GTF.
And I'm your host, Alicia Lindsay, 2019 GTF.
And we are excited to welcome you to the podcast.
Yes, FFX Summer Sizzle. That's the Friday Further X. We are excited to welcome our August guest, Wendi Pillars.
I'm Wendi Pillars, otherwise known as Ian's mom. I have been teaching for more than 2 decades now. I've worked primarily with our English language learners, and I have worked in grades K through 12, starting so long ago, pre-internet. That's why I started using visuals in my classroom. So if a student didn't understand something, it's really hard to explain in words to somebody who doesn't know the language. So I say, okay, well, here's a quick sketch. And they laugh at it because it's ridiculous, but they get it and we move on. So it was fun, but it saved some time. It helped engage the students on a different level. And they also remembered it better.
With the new school year upon us and a very interesting one behind us, we felt it would be a good idea to work on mapping our mindset to get us through the school year ahead. Now, I know many of you may have already started your trek through the semester's plane, and that is okay because it doesn't hurt to work through your already established plan, since that's what teachers do. To help us with our mind mapping, we asked the silent cartographer, 2017 GTF, and 2-time author Wendi Pillars to join us today. Wendi is the author of Visual Note-Taking for Educators, A Teacher's Guide to Student Creativity, and Visual Impact, Transform Communication in Your Boardroom, Classroom, or Living Room.
Once I realized how much of an impact it was for students, then I wrote my first book where I go through some of the neuroscience behind it because I wanted to find out what I was missing as an instructor with a lot of my students. A turning point for me was just a few years ago with one of my high school classes. And again, these are language learners. They were advanced language learners. So I knew without a doubt that they knew what the word house meant. So I put the word up on the board. We were about to do a unit on migration. I just wanted to see how they represented it visually, what came out. And as I walked around, I gave them 3 minutes. And I said, create a visual based on that word up there. I didn't even say it. And I walked around, and every single student drew a house with people in it. And I thought about it. And then when I got home that night, I went to different adults that I knew. And I said, visually represent this word. Same word, house. And everybody drew a different type of structure. Some had a cross on it, some like different places they had lived, what it looked like. And it was so stark to me how different these expressions were. And these were all like 17 and 18-year-old boys. And I remember just going, oh my gosh, if I had said, you guys know what this word means, right? Good, all right, we're gonna move on. I would have never had 3 minutes worth of time to get that insight into what my students were thinking. And it was crazy because it was at the beginning of the semester. And when I look back on those houses and compare them to the personalities of the kids, they were so telling. You know, like my jokester had little cartoons of people and saying things. And then my really shy, introverted kid had tiny little people that represented everybody in his family. It was a turning point for me, big time. And I was like, oh my gosh, if such a simple concept carries so much weight in my students' minds, what else am I missing? So then I just started figuring out, well, how can I get them to visually represent this or this or this? We would do it with pre-assessments, we'd do it as bell ringers, we would do it on a sticky note, we would do it on larger paper, we would do it individually, collaboratively. It was just action research. So it became more like a game for me. Gosh, how can I use this again?
I did that this summer. I was telling you how, remember earlier I said I'm using visual note taking for my chemistry class. And my final for this summer was, we did several different labs this week. I want you to draw what happened and try to go down to the molecular level. Try to go deeper with your instruction. I had never seen or thought that my students knew or had picked up on that many concepts within the week. Their drawings blew my mind. They were detailed, they were labeled, they used colors, and they drew some great things. And I was really blown away by that. But I had practiced, I remember that story about the house and in the houses that you had them draw. I actually drew my house before going on in the book just to see what I would draw. And then my house had trees, it had a garage, it had foliage, person out there outside working. But looking at their different thought processes in molecular structure and how things work and interact was really interesting because it was their interpretations on what they were seeing visually in this lab, this demonstration, and how those things interacted with each other.
Yeah, and it's more fun to grade too,
Yes.
right? Or
Yeah.
assess.
So,
oh my gosh!
I agree.
But I love that you use it with chemistry because I feel like I've heard from teachers of different ages who teach different age students. When I first got to the high school here, I started in a high school in a different place, and then I worked my way through K5 and K8 and back to the high school. And when I brought this to the high school, teachers would say, "Oh, are you going to draw pictures again in class today?" I was like, "You betcha. Absolutely. And you're more than welcome to come on in and see what happens when we do this." And it's like when the students have permission to sit and create, there's a totally different vibe in the room. Like, it gets quiet and kids are focused. And this mix of how do I draw this versus, well, what should we put on here? And even the collaborative efforts, the conversations that come up that are so organic. They're talking about, well, what do you think would best represent XYZ? Or I'm thinking, oh my God, I couldn't manufacture these conversations. This is fantastic.
Wendi, I just wanted to really thank you for writing Visual Impact. For our listeners, Visual Impact, transform communication in your boardroom, classroom, or living room. I was at the 2019 GTF training in DC, and you gifted our group your first book. And I devoured that, and I think you're yes, Kelly's showing it for our listeners. Kelly's showing it on our Zoom.
I have read this, yes, and I'm on the next one.
Yeah, and what I loved about your new one, it was exactly what I needed to take the next step. The page of explanation and then the visual, because I see in visual, but drawing is really hard for me. I never had good instruction from art educators, so I see it in my head, but I can't translate it on paper. But your book is helping me take those steps to overcoming it is fearful for me to draw in front of people because I'm like, oh my gosh, But I really appreciate simple things like, here's how you can do arrows, here's how you can do lines. It takes the stigma of illustrating your thinking and it makes it very accessible. So I really appreciate that you wrote this book to make it accessible for people like me who want to draw but don't know how to draw.
So there's a different level of critical thinking that comes through even with stick figures and really basic icons. And I think that's what, when people say I'm not a good artist or I'm afraid to draw, it's like, you know what? the worse you draw, the more inviting it is for students.
Yeah.
Because everybody feels that fear and they're like, oh, I can do better than that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, they do.
We did a whole stick figure drawing thing at the beginning of summer school, and when they saw my stuff, theirs, I just said, I'm just gonna think of you all sitting in a chair, like I'm gonna think of my friend and when they do this, and that's what I'll draw in stick figures. And they actually they were doing better than myself, some of them, they were really rocking it. But when I did ask the students, I'd ask them each week, so how's this going? How is this visual note taking? What do you like about it? And many of the comments each time were, I like it better than a normal class. And I explained the difference, similar to what our conversation was last time, Alicia, about listening, the difference between listening and hearing. Their ability to listen was better. We talked about how listening, the person has a purpose when you listen, whereas if you're just hearing me talk, that's the siren, the ambulance going down the street, and you can't avoid that, or you can't avoid it. And so, but listening, you have a purpose, and so by making their learning visual, they have a purpose in listening to you now, because they have to create an image that's representing what we're talking about in class as a collaborative group. I think it provides some ownership too. They were saying how they appreciated it because it was what they wanted to put down on the paper, rather than what you're being told to put down on the paper and what they interpreted it to be.
It allows them to experiment in a way that using screens doesn't, because when they have their computers, they have access, like I mentioned, to the answers. And so it's either right or it's wrong because you looked it up. Whereas when you are creating a visual, you have that time to think. And then just as both of you mentioned, our students can be really creative and surprise us with their depth of expression.
That's the power of visual note-taking, is it's the ownership piece. I think probably many educators who are listening went to school during the time where it was the very linear notes, you had to have that certain style, like the outline style, and there's nothing wrong with that, because that's how some people function and think. But I think when you're looking at this generation of kids whose lives are very visual and whose lives are consumed by many forms of visual media, having the opportunity to learn how to use visuals in a meaningful way for learning is really important, to maybe show the distinction between visual media that's in your face from wherever versus creating visuals for very specific ways to help improve who you are as a person and as a learner.
I want to piggyback on what you're saying about like the visuals and the consuming of visuals and like that rapid pace where they're so accustomed to speed and precision. Like, okay, I can look up the exact answer for this and there's no room for making a mistake. But then one of the things I prefer markers and hand-drawn. In my class, we don't really have the technology for that anyway. So, like for all the students to have access tech-wise to digital note-taking. So I use just regular paper and usually a flare pen, the big flare, and go on with it. And it decelerates. It doesn't make it easier, but it decelerates their thinking so that they have time to absorb what's been taught, making those connections. And then I feel like if we assume that they know something and move on, we really could be missing out on some incredible insights.
If you could explain the power of the doodle and its ability to guide our mind mapping processes, maybe tie in a little bit of getting back into this school year and how the power of the doodle can help guide us in our mind mapping.
I love your title for this, The Silent Cartographer, because for me that relates back to that deceleration piece. So I feel like when emotions are amped up or anxiety is high, having a different way of regrouping and also of getting everybody on the same page is through using visual thinking, and just being able to sit with an idea for a slightly extended amount of time is something that may or may not have happened over the past few months or year or so. And so to allow students that permission to experiment with what they're able to do, that to me is a good way to start even the first week or so of school, instead of having an icebreaker. Let students work individually and create a student profile with markers. What is something that you look forward to? What is something fun about yourself that you can share? What's your favorite thing to draw? Or what's your favorite words? So that way you have the verbal minded and you have the more artistic. They have opportunities to express themselves visually. I also think that when we use visual thinking, it's also an opportunity for people to take that abstract concept and make it more tangible. And it's easy enough to say, oh yeah, I know what a house is, or I know what that means. But then when you ask somebody to explain it, I know it when I read it, but I can't really explain it. Or then you take it a step further and say, represent it visually. You're tapping into different thinking skills. So it's very powerful that way. And when you're using this mind mapping or whatever, I like to use the term visual thinking. When you use that at the beginning of the year, it kind of reawakens some dormant areas of the brain that probably haven't been tapped into, especially during these past few months. And again, it's permission, but I always tell my students that the more pathways in that you can provide for your information that you're learning, the more access points you're going to have when you want to recall it or retrieve it. So when we use visuals, we are listening, we are reading, we are speaking, we are communicating, and then you're visualizing. So you have all these different pathways. And it kind of sets the students up for more success, because you're also giving them, like you mentioned before, some ownership in their learning, and they see it more visibly when it is tangible and concrete.
According to Wendi's first book, Visual Note-Taking for Educators, Alan Paivio's dual coding theory proposed that recall and recognition is enhanced by presenting information in both visual and verbal form. In addition, students transform an abstract mental image into a concrete visual image, translating a dialect of their subconscious into pictures along with key words from the original text or speech to take notes. What recommendations do you have for transforming our mindset through visualization and putting pens, pencils, and markers to paper to make sense of that journey?
So the first thing is just start. I think there's this trepidation around what I can do or what I can't do. So just start. Even if you add one icon or one small sketch to something that you're doing, that's all you need to do. Ask for help. Number 2, ask for help. So if you don't know how to represent something, look it up. I've done things with my students where we go to YouTube and learn how to draw a gorilla because that was the main character of a story, and we all learn together. And then you see nothing but gorillas on every paper for the next 2 weeks, but it works, right? You're learning together. Or you can ask your students, how would you represent this? Right? So ask for help. 3, I always encourage using a marker. If you use a pencil, you're going to be prone to erase every single thing. So you own your mistakes. And again, it's that experimenter's mindset. Be curious, right? Everything that you do is data. So how can you use that stray mark for something else? And that leads to having fun. But so yeah, get curious would be, what am I on? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get curious. Again, how can I connect this visually? What do I already know that I can pull in to enhance what I'm doing or deepen my understanding of this? The next one would be to consider audience. Who are these sketches for? Is this just for me? Is it for, another student to look at? Is it going to be displayed? Am I going to get to revise this sketch? Is this a draft? So whoever the audience is really important. If it's just for me as a teacher, man, my stuff is a mess, right? When I'm planning out a unit or when I'm planning out a lesson, it is a hot mess. But if I know that somebody else is going to see it, I'll clean it up a little bit. If I'm doing it for an organization, I will ask, what are your goals for this visual? What do you want out of it? So depending on audience. And then definitely have fun. Like, you should be laughing in class, and that is ideal because, again, it lowers that affective filter of students, and they see, oh my gosh, okay, this doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm learning and I'm going to remember this because now I know how to draw an elephant and how that relates to XYZ.
I really love your tips because I'm like, yes, I can do this. Yes, I can enter into that and I'm not going to feel anxious. So thank you for that.
And as I say them, I'm imagining that they should be in a visual instead of just listed.
I see that coming up somewhere.
Yes,
Somebody,
I think so.
I think that's going to be drawn eventually or visualized. There we go.
Oh, and then one more really, really important tip. I can't believe I forgot it. Don't ever judge like the artistic value or presentation of anybody's work. This is so much about the process and the thinking behind it. I always use the phrase, tell me more about your visual. And that way there's no judgment there. I have seen some work, I don't recognize what the lines are on somebody's paper, but when I say, tell me more about your visual, the insight. I am so humbled by what they come up with and how they make connections. Like, it gives me goosebumps just to even say that. So tell me more, no judgment.
Our next question is, how can our own mapping help students to think more visually and make meaning?
There's a couple of ways to look at that. One is, again, if we are mapping and modeling for them as we map or visualize the content, that gives them permission to see what we're doing. But it also slows down. When I think about visualizing something, I am extracting the absolute essence of material and just drilling down to that essence. And then from there, we can build out from, with details. But I feel like with my own mapping in front of students, it is a clarifying tool. Also, as far as mapping, like we mentioned earlier, where, I might map out a unit or a text or something so that they can see where we are, what we need to do to get to point B and then point C. So it's not only like a goal setting tool, but more importantly for me, it's like a process developing tool. So they see that even if you have a goal, you have to go step by step by step, and that there is a process or a system that gets you from one point to the other. And then from there, like, you can apply that to my class, as I'm sure yours are too, is like, we're not just teaching content, we're teaching kids. So that metacognitive piece, it's not enough to set a personal goal. It's about the process of getting there. So, okay, you want to graduate. That's great. What are you going to do between now? You're a freshman. There's a lot of space in there. What are you going to do? So what are your stepping stones? What are your keystone habits that you're going to include in that process? So by modeling how we progress from one point to another, even in a unit or a text, we're being exemplars for them as far as modeling personal goals. How are you going to get from point A to point B? And so they see what it takes. They learn that achieving a goal is not typically a linear process, that we can come back and revisit and then go forward, revisit, spiral back, and we're showing how we react to those proverbial wrenches that are thrown into the mix. And so modeling metacognitive piece, and then to think about our thinking, we used to do that with read alouds all the time. Well, this is, I guess it's a think aloud for life, right? Where we think about how does this work? And Kelly, you mentioned this, how you check in with your students and say, how's this working for you? And it gives them a little bit more buy-in and investment and reflection time. So that metacognitive piece is huge. A lot of visual thinking is about listening. That comes into play as well. So you mentioned that too. We're listening for what is being said as well as what is not explicitly being stated. A lot of listening goes into this.
Well, and I want to lift up in your new book, Visual Impact, you have a whole section at the end for our listeners who do have the book. It starts on page 186, but it's a whole bonus chapter about goal setting, and you've given some really great templates. That was actually my favorite part of the book. I was like, yes, wow, this is for me, or this is for how I could start off maybe the beginning of the year with some of my students. But I really appreciated those because they were really helpful ways that I think somebody new to this process can enter in and find success, as well as finding success with students by using something that you've created to get them started in that realm of visual thinking.
And I would totally tailor that. So I was just throwing ideas on there, and I encourage readers to just pull pieces and parts to create your own. Those are how they could look, but it's also a lot of information crammed into one small piece, which could be overwhelming.
Well, that leads us to our final question. And I'll say it slow because it has 3 elements to it. So tell us 3 things you are curious about, 2 things you have observed recently, and 1 story you are telling now.
You guys know how to throw the hard punches, don't you? So 3 things I'm curious about. My thinking is pretty much consumed with climate change right now. And so I think one thing I'm curious about is how I can tell a better story about our changing climate so that more people will be inspired to both believe in the science and then take action. So that's one thing I'm curious about. Another thing that I am curious about is how I can tap into my students' curiosity and bring it alive this year. That's something, I don't know, curiosity or worry about? I don't know. But I'm curious about that. And my mom's having some health issues right now, so I'm curious why the doctors aren't able to help her with. She's got some vocal cord paralysis, which is really unique, but I'm just curious why that doesn't have more solutions at hand for that. 2 things I've observed lately. I have a huge butterfly bush right outside my kitchen window. So I have observed bees and butterflies and hummingbirds and beautiful shades of color in green, which just, I stare out that window all the time, especially, because you're in the kitchen all the time, right? So that brings my mind back and gives me hope and settles my very busy thinking side. And let's see, what else have I observed? The second thing I've observed, I have observed myself being increasingly grateful for things like running water in my house, clean water, fuel, climate control, and just the availability of resources kind of at the snap of a finger for where I am, especially as I read more and see more on the news about places that are really struggling with survival. So that's something that I've observed. One story I'm telling now, I'm trying to work on telling a climate change story. Like, I'm creating a small cast of characters with facts about climate change, but ironically, I just need to get over my trepidation of putting it out into the world. So that's the story I am working on telling now.
It would be an interesting story to tell and to hear from your perspective.
Another piece of it too is just the mapping piece. Like, so many content areas, if you can just get that sense of place and then map it and then add to it, it enriches whatever you're learning on a different level.
Educators, we want to hear from you. How do you map your mindset for the school year? Add your ideas to the GTFurther hashtags on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. The hashtags are #ConnectingFurther, #EducatorExplorer.
That's all for this episode of FFX Summer Sizzle. For more on today's episode and the latest further updates, you can always visit https://educatorexplorersfurther.blogspot.com or visit us on Facebook on the natgeoed/GT Fellows page. A special thanks to Wendi Pillars for joining us for this episode. This podcast is brought to you by the GTFurther Team in conjunction with Cartography.
We go further when we honor the trek.
I know podcast hosts ask this all the time, but for real, please take the time to rate, review, and share this podcast. It really does help other people find the show. And, of course, we like reading the reviews. This is the last episode of our Summer Sizzle series, so stay tuned for our fall rendition for the GTFurther community.
We really thank all of you for listening, and we hope you've enjoyed the Summer Sizzle series. This is your host, Alicia Lindsay.
And Kelly Mead.
And we can't wait to see you for some of our fall launches, so stay tuned and we'll keep you updated.
FFX Summer Sizzle is a GTFurther Team original production. It's hosted by Alicia Lindsay and Kelly V. Mead. From South Dakota, California, and Colorado, the show is produced by Ann C. Lewis, Kelly V. Mead, and Alicia Lindsay. Editing, sound, design, and original scoring by Kelly V. Mead, with help from nature.